DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals from 2012, and Deferred Action for Parents of Americans from 2014 are the federal programs we just heard President Obama refer to. Established by his executive actions, they were designed to provide temporary deportation relief and work permits for 4 million undocumented immigrants.
Last month's split decision upholds the ruling of the Fifth Court of Circuit Appeals, which had prevented these programs from going into effect. It also means that new applications to DAPA and DACA are suspended until the legal stalemate is broken.
Joining us today is César Vargas, an immigrant rights activist and recipient of the DACA program. Welcome to BK Live. And Carlene Pinto, immigration campaign manager at the New York Immigration Coalition. Hello.
Thank you both very much for being here on BK Live.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
César, why don't we start with you? Let's start by how do you explain this Supreme Court decision, and two-part question, what it means for immigrants moving forward?
Yeah, well, from a very, very human level, it means that millions of parents, millions of children who were raised here, who have families here, won't be able to have that deportation relief. The shadow of deportation is still lingering in people's lives. So at the very least, that is something that, it was really tragic what we heard from the Supreme Court. But at the same time, what it means at the Supreme Court is that we didn't actually lose the fight. The legal grounds were not actually resulted. They were resolved. What actually means that we were in a tie, right? Because of the death of Justice Scalia, the justice couldn't really decide whether or not the president actually acted within his authority. So we are in a stalemate, which is, it really raises 2 points. One, we need to make sure that we are appointing and confirming the next Supreme Court justice. And second, most importantly, we need to make sure that we are resolving the legal question of whether or not the president has the authority. And we are confident that the law is on our side, and we are confident that ultimately the courts are going to rule in our favor.
Okay. Can we tell our audience the difference between DACA and DAPA?
Yeah, well, DAPA is pretty much for many parents of U.S. citizen children or legal permanent. And DACA is for the children who came here when they were little and grew up here. I'm a recipient of DACA. I came here when I was 5 years old. I've grown here. New York City has been my home. Brooklyn has been my home. And that's the program that pretty much DACA is really related to. DAPA is mostly for our parents. My parents, my mother, who's 74 years old, would have qualified for DAPA. So when we heard the decision, it was definitely heartbreaking because it meant that my mom would still be, could be deported anytime.
I think a very important part of the conversation as well is President Obama created these programs to address issues in Congress. Congress would not pass comprehensive immigration reform, and so he saw the need for these programs because at the core of American values is family. And now we have millions of mixed status families that would have benefited from these programs that now their families are still living in fear. And so 5 million people nationally, 300,000 New Yorkers could have benefited from expanded DACA and DAPA.
And now who knows? For somebody who doesn't know, as somebody who receives DACA, what sort of benefits does that entitle you to over the course of your life?
Well, for me, let's just say this. When I was able to qualify for DACA and actually get my DACA card, which is pretty much a plastic card that says that you're part of this country, you're recognized as an American. And for me, I was so excited. I know many people dread going to the DMV, but I was excited. It was for the first time in almost 25 years that I was able to get plastic that pretty much, for me, it meant me being part of New York, me being part of this nation. And, it's something that is not citizenship, but it's definitely, it's a step to make sure that we are moving to ensure that this nation is inclusive and welcoming. And ultimately, the ultimate decision is obviously comprehensive immigration reform, but in the meantime, we need to stop deportation. We need to make sure that children, we need to have parents can go to work without having to fear of being stopped by the police and not having an ID.
Well, are there other avenues to receive citizenship status other than DACA or DAPA?
So the issue right now is that the programs that exist across the board are not addressing the needs of our immigrant communities nationally, right? And so one thing that New York immigration prides itself on is that we have a diverse mix of immigrants from all over the world in our communities through the state. And depending on where you come from, there may be a temporary protected status that may be available to people coming from your country under whatever circumstances may be, socioeconomically inclined in that region. There may be asylum. There's other avenues, but they're given out at very small percentages. And so when we look at 11 million people are estimated to be living out of status, right? Out of status doesn't mean that they just crossed the border. It means that they came here legally and their visas could have expired. Programs that they were eligible for may have been, discontinued. And so when we're talking about comprehensive immigration reform, the 5 million people that would have benefited from these programs, we didn't see this. This was a small win on the forefront of real, just immigration reform nationally that would address the needs of 11+ million people that, like César, have mixed status families and or have been here since they're 5 years old.
Interesting. I wish we had hours to talk about this.
Right.
I have so many questions. César, you spoke. You worked closely with Bernie Sanders. I want to talk about the presidential campaign with you, César, real quick. We know where this Donald Trump guy stands on some of these issues. Where do you think Hillary Clinton stands, and where do you see this in terms of being a crossroads for immigration, who becomes the next president?
Well, I think this election, 2016, is very, very significant because, so many immigrants were actively involved in this campaign. For myself, I'm undocumented, I cannot vote, but I had the opportunity to work with the senator to draft and craft the immigration platform that is the most expensive than any candidate. And actually, I'm heading to Orlando to the Democratic National Committee Platform Committee, where we are actually going to be finalizing the Democratic Party's platform on an array of issues, specifically for me, immigration. So right now, where we stand is we are making sure that both candidates, Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton, are adopting the most progressive, the most expansive and humane immigration platform. And that means not just expanding DACA, but it also means returning deported families back, deporting veterans that we deport in this country. It means providing temporary protection status to children who come here escaping violence. It also means ensuring that we have an opportunity to have a path to citizenship for as many people as possible. So at this point, this election is so critical because on one hand, we have the xenophobia of Donald Trump and the far right, and then we have the Democratic Party that we're trying to push to make sure that we are working to adopt the most progressive platform. And for me, what matters is to ensure that both candidates are realizing that we need immigration reform. We need it now.
And can I just ask a quick follow-up? For people who may not know, how do you think that xenophobia, as you put it, of Donald Trump would affect the future of the country?
Well, when he's talking about raids, when he's talking about deportations, we are, this is not just a theoretical concept. This means that, at 6 a.m. in the morning, immigration agents, 20 of them at times, can come for a family with, in the middle of the night. So that's pretty scary for, 2 little children and a parent who's just working. But at the same time, we need to hold accountable Democrats as well, because the reality is Donald Trump talks about deportations. And President Obama has done deportations, over 2 million deportations. So for me, when we're talking about the election, we're talking about that our loyalty lies in our families to stop deportations, keep families together, not about a political party.
I think it's important, too, that we pivot and we understand that because Congress did not act on these issues, that is why we're even having this discussion on a national platform and on a national level with the presidential elections. It's important that people locally in New York also understand that these are very important congressional elections that are upon us, both in our state and across the country, and we need to begin to hold people accountable. So folks do have the power to get up, get out and vote. There's lots of social media platforms that will tell you about where these candidates stand on the platforms. You can follow our organization, specifically New York Immigration Coalition. We always speak broadly about, policies and, folks that are doing good things and should be supported. And so I just want to make sure that folks know that we need you to vote. I mean, César even just said that he does not have the right to vote. So why are people not hitting those ballots and being his voice for him and his family? We need you.
Right. And just to place it into reality, if people don't vote, what could possibly happen?
Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That's right.
Scary.
People used to say that, he cannot win the Republican nomination. We
Here
are.
And we're watching
Here we
it.
are. And
Right.
we're watching it happen.
Carlene, you want to get more specifically into this call to action? I mean, how do people really get involved with not just your immigration coalition, but other causes that you may know of?
So specifically, I think that social media and digital media has created a space where people can learn these issues and verse themselves from the comfort of their own homes, and then we can meet folks where they are. And so specifically on the topics of immigration, right now, the Department of Justice has 25 days to file a response for a rehearing in this DAPA DACA case, right? And so we may be organizing people on July 15th and 16th to send a national message in coalition with people all over the country as a mass day of action to call on the Department of Justice to make sure that this case is reheard when we have a full bench with the Supreme Court. And so specifically, I would tell people that New York Immigration Coalition, you can find us online on social media platforms, Forward US. They do a lot of infographics and they, put everything to stats and numbers, which is really helpful when we're fighting a lot of, the propaganda that the media says around some of the numbers and issues, especially around a lot of Trump's statements.
Right. But how do we get people to vote? I mean, César, you worked with Bernie Sanders. Some Bernie Sanders lovers, they are fanatical. They say if Bernie didn't win, we're not voting for Hillary. We're obviously not voting for Trump. How do you get people to actually vote?
Well, it's talking to the communities, and I think for us, one of the things that we successfully did, that we were able to, really win as many states as we did when people didn't expect this campaign to even go anywhere, was talking directly to people, and that's where we actually went directly to communities here in Staten Island, in the North Shore, in Brooklyn, in Westchester, upstate New York. So for me, that's one of the exactly talk to them and actually say these are the issues that matter. And at the end, it's like, when people are saying I'm not going to vote for this candidate or the other, it's because we want to make sure for us that the Democratic Party is actually adopting the most humane immigration platform than any candidate. And that's a reality. Secretary Carlene has had a record that we haven't been proud of. And specifically, she said we need to deport and need to send back the children who are coming from Central America. That doesn't sound like a Democrat, right? That sounds, probably someone from the other side. So we're willing to work with both parties. We're willing to work with Secretary Carlene. But we need to make sure that that our community sends a strong message through voting, through organizing, that we need to protect our families. We need a bold immigration platform. And for us, it doesn't matter of the party or the candidate. What matters is the bold ideas and the bold action to really bring that relief.
And what you mentioned before when we're talking about, layered issues, especially in our communities, I think it's important that we make sure that we're having these conversations with potential voters that, you shouldn't just be a single issue voter, right? And so when we're talking about issues in our communities, they go around racial profiling, they go around, access to resources. Right now, New York State only allocates 1% of the needs for adult language literacy for immigrant communities through the state. That looks like we need to be reinvesting some of our resources and monies in other areas. Maybe it looks like retraining in communities that we see, generational issues around socioeconomic obstacles, right? And so I'm saying this because there are platforms that will give you additional information. You can even find me on social media, and I will entertain these conversations with voters because we need you to vote, and we need you to look at all of these issues affecting our communities, and how do we act in solidarity with one another to hold our political parties accountable for the most just and humane policies. It's all about the policies.
And getting back to this Supreme Court ruling with just a few seconds left, what do you hope? I mean, it's going to be back into the lower courts now. What do you hope is the future of this ruling as we move forward?
Well, I would hope that the Department of Justice files for a rehearing, and that after Congress moves on, affirming a new Supreme Court justice, that the case is reheard and we win, when it's reheard potentially in the fall. And then hopefully an implementation process right behind where millions of people can begin to register for these programs.
And simply one more thing, the president has more powers than just DACA and DAPA. He can actually stop the raids. He can stop deportations. He can bring people back who were deported. Veterans, we have veterans, people who fought for this country who have been deported. The president can do much more. So yes, we need to make sure win on the Supreme Court, but the president has more powers that he can actually implement. And whether it's Bernie Sanders, Secretary Carlene, or Obama, they have the power right now.
César, Carlene, thank you very much for the great work that you do, and thank you for being on BK Live.
Thank you so much
for
having
Great
us.
job. Say hi to Senator Sanders for us.
Absolutely.